What is going on, you guys? It's your boy Tropical Thunder, and today I have a brand new video for you guys. So about a week ago, Dan Greenawalt went on the Smoking Tire podcast to talk about his new game, Forza Motorsport 7. There were a lot of things that were said on the podcast, so if you guys want to hear the whole thing, I'll be putting a link down in the description for you guys. And I believe the duration of the the podcast is around like an hour and 30 minutes, but I've basically summarized and condensed all the valuable information concerning Forza Motorsport 7. And along with this video, I'll be making some of my thoughts and opinions regarding the issues that were brought up in the podcast. So a couple of things that Dan mentioned, and I'm pretty sure some of us already knew this, but Forza 7 will be playable on Xbox One, Xbox One X, Windows 10, and obviously Xbox One X when it comes out. Dan brought up that, and I thought this was very interesting, he himself still uses a 1080p when using the Xbox One X, especially when it comes to the competitive side of gaming, because it has a lower response rate, meaning that the input onto the TV is less lag. He added that Forza 7 still looks amazing on the 1080p TV or monitor, and it's basically the reason why is because they're able to super sample the whatever is shown on the TV or monitor. Super sampling means that you're basically squeezing this 4K video into like a 1080p, so it still looks good, and it doesn't sacrifice maybe just a little bit of sacrifice of the graphic fidelity. With this being said, I still think it's still safe to keep our 1080p monitors or TVs. So some of the things that were brought up on the podcast were Porsche's 6-year partnership with Forza. As we all know, there's 700 cars at the launch of the game, with the largest lineup of Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Porsches in any game. With these new Porsches, Dan Greenawalt believes that it will hopefully create greater experiences with the drivers in-game and in real life. For example, at E3, it was the first time ever in any gaming show, even at a gaming show, that a new car was announced, specifically the Porsche 911 GT2 RS. Another example is that at Le Mans, Forza racers who participated and placed at the championship stood at the podium alongside with those who placed at the Le Mans in real life. So I guess it's really amazing to see that the players who compete at eSports, the virtual reality side of things, are recognized for their accomplishments and their unique skills. And this is actually the very first time eSports has ever been legitimized by real life motorsport, like the motorsport side of things. However, during the podcast, there were some concerns and there's some arguments that were brought up when it comes to the rules of the competition or the rules of the championship. I didn't know this either, but players who compete on the series of leagues and championships on Forza, they play on the controller. Now, I always thought that they always play with the racing wheel, but and to be honest, I don't really care if they played on the controller. I didn't mind it. I always assumed that they played on a racing wheel. And one of the members on the podcast, and I think his name is Matt, he tried to argue with Dan that he should make eSports competitors play with a wheel, since it is a racing game and it is like something as big as a championship. And honestly, to me, I get where Matt is coming from, because the closest thing you pretty much get into real life racing is basically on a simulation wheel setup, because it involves your hands, it involves your feet, your lower body basically, and with a controller, you're basically just using your fingers and thumbs, right? But at the same time, to argue against this, Dan Greenawalt brought up a good point that esport players, not all of them have the luxury of owning a wheel setup at their home and at their own disposal. And most of his players actually prefer playing on a controller. And I get what Dan is saying. Like, imagine if a new player joins Forza, like the Forza racing community, because they grow a passion for cars and basically playing the Forza game. Later down, they start to show interest in the competitive aspect of esports, but they later find out that they're unable to participate because they have to learn on how to play on a wheel setup. But how do you tell that person that they can't participate when they've always been playing on a controller? It's just not fair. So pretty much Dan said, quote, he can't mold his players to play this way. I'm assuming playing on a wheel. He can only get them passionate in cars and car culture. Forza is in the process of developing a new form of motorsport, and I think that new form is playing a controller. It's going to take a few years to accomplish this, but instead of you have to be this high-end or that high-end, or you have to play like this or you have to play like that, they have to consider that if people have that disability, or if they're coming from a lower economic background, they want them to still come to our world, play Forza, and be part of cars. And Dan pretty much said that he does not want anything else to get in the way, meaning, like playing on a racing wheel, or not having the luxury of playing on a racing wheel. Now, my opinion towards this whole issue kind of goes along with what Matt said later on in the podcast, which is basically this: the competitors, the upper echelon, the ones who compete, the ones who fly out to Le Mans, who get all these sponsorships and compete for prizes, they should pretty much play on the wheel. So I'm not really on the boat on the whole thing, but I think that it's best for if they have like pretty much like a separate league. You have a wheel user league, and you also have people who want to play on a controller, right? So for example, at Le Mans, they could have had like a separate league between the controllers and the wheel users, or they could have combined them, but they would have been happening at the same time. If the esports side of Forza does decide to go with this route, personally, I believe they can get closer to their goal of being this legitimized and recognition from the different disciplines of the motorsports out there in real life. Dan and the developers, they really like to claim that their game is a racing simulator, but it's kind of hard to like convince the real professional drivers that are out there, and basically the motorsport community, if they find out that you're holding championship races and the competitors are just using controllers. I mean, don't get me wrong, like I'm not against players using the controllers at all. Like I kind of like that because there's some variety, and it just doesn't close the window for these opportunities to compete in the esports side of things. But it's also important for Forza to represent its community and all its drivers. And even though the wheel user community is not that big for the console, because mostly people use a controller anyways, it would still look good if they represented them. And if you do have those people who are that high upper echelon, wanting to compete with a wheel, and there's a lot of good wheel players out there. So hopefully this they do implement this in going down Forza Motorsport 7, that they do include this in part of their championships and in their racing events. So on the topic of wheels, Dan also mentioned that the variety of vintage wheels and also the modern wheels that we have right now are pretty much playable with Forza Motorsport 7. As far as like a compatibility list, he didn't really give anything in specific, but I'm assuming that there's like a wide variety of them. On top of racing wheels, I think this is pretty silly, but you can play also on a DDR pad, or if you want to play on a Guitar Hero drum set, or like even on a guitar, it's playable. So I know we had these featured back in Forza Horizon 3, but the wide body kits are definitely coming to Forza Motorsport 7. And this is actually the first time that it will be featured in any Forza Motorsport game. So there is also a Q&A segment of the podcast. Now the first question was, how does Forza choose which tracks to come on Forza 7? To basically summarize what Dan said, popularity of the tracks from the Forza community and its developers, and the availability of photogrammetry. I hope I said that right. But photogrammetry, it's like laser scanning, video, and taking pictures of the tracks, and it's basically to make it like more detailed, right? That all has to be considered when trying to make these, in deciding which tracks come into future motorsport titles or future any Forza title. So some might be asking, what happens to the tracks that are fictional, like Fujimi Kaido? Well, from what I got from the podcast, Dan pretty much said that the fictional tracks that are requested, they have to be built from the ground up, and it's very hard to do that if you can't use something like photogrammetry. So what I'm assuming is that it takes more time for the developers to build fictional tracks. That's my guess. Dan didn't really hit on the whole like fictional tracks issue. Like he was, I don't know, to me it seemed like he was kind of sidestepping the issue. I'm assuming that it takes a little bit more time. But as far as tracks being updated, Dan said that they are continuously updating tracks as far as like things getting resurfaced, or certain things getting added on the track, outside the track. They're constantly being updated. So another question that was brought up was, what type of physics improvements can we expect in the game? Dan answered this question by saying that they've been experimenting on how tarmac changes in friction non-linearly. Now this means that, you know, temperature affects the tarmac, affects the road, affects the surface, and you know there's different factors that also have to be put in. For example, like rain, as it hits the surface of the track. If it's like dry heat, you know, it's like high heat, the cold, and it's something that is not linear, but it happens realistically over time. So I'm assuming there's like that change that's being improved also in the game. Dan also added that for the wheel users that are out there, that the force feedback of the game has been improved. Now he went a little bit more detailed than just saying that. He says some features that we can expect in force feedback in Forza Motorsport 7 is that we can feel the parts of the car shaking. So I'm guessing we can feel that on the wheel. Drivers have an inverse kinetic system. Personally, I have no idea what that means. But we do have, this is what I'm looking forward most to. He said that improved self-aligning torque to come back to center, especially like when you're doing things such as drifting, and bumping into walls have a dramatic effect on our wheels as well. So I'm very happy to hear that, you know, we have this improved self-aligning torque, because that was a huge issue back in Forza Motorsport 6 and Forza Horizon 3. I mean, it's better in Forza Horizon 3, but it's still a little bit lacking. It's still a little lackluster. But that's pretty much all the information I have for you guys. Again, I hope you guys are having a great day. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more information on Forza Motorsport 7, since this is something that I'll be covering as the time comes. And when it comes out, when the game releases, I'll be doing a full review after the release. I'll see you guys on the next one.